This is Sales Players, and I'm your host, Jesse Woodbury. I've spent my career selling for early stage companies, and now I'm on a mission to help reps and operators find tips, strategies, and resources for generating more pipeline, closing more deals, and building wealth in tech sales. To learn more, visit salesplayers.co. Hey everyone, it's Jesse here, and in today's episode, I am going to share the story of when I joined an early stage seed series company as the founding account executive. And the reason I want to share this story is a lot of people have been reaching out over the last couple of months from the Slack community, from my coaching clients, and just from my network at large, asking me what my 2 cents is on working as the founding sales hire or founding SDR, founding account executive in an early stage startup company. And I feel pretty qualified to talk about this. I've done that twice now in my career. And then I've done several other roles where I was in the first few sales hires at a early Series A or Series B company. And that's actually what I do right now. I'm at an early stage company at the moment. Now, I've done a little bit of both. I've been at some bigger companies, of course, and some smaller ones. So I'm going to do another episode on what it was like to work for a 70,000 person company. But in this episode, rather than go through and debate the pros and cons of working as the founding account executive in an early stage startup, I thought I'd just tell you the story of how it happened to me, what I worked on while I was there, and ultimately what the result of that experience was. My hope is that from hearing my story, you'll be able to better assess whether it's the right opportunity for you or whether you're someone who would prefer to just go to a later stage growth scale-up company or even a big publicly traded tech company. There's really no right answers. Your career is your career, and you've got to find what works best for you in terms of lifestyle, earnings, and what you're most passionate about. I happen to be someone who's very entrepreneurial, and so for me, I was always compelled to go and work for an early stage startup, mostly because I love to learn, I'm super curious, and being in early startups gives you direct access to the founders, which is an amazing thing if you're someone who wants to learn what happens behind the curtain and learn how to launch a product or how to get really scrappy with building a proposal or an offer. So for me, this was a great opportunity overall. But let's get into how it all came about. So the story actually starts when I was working for a large Bay Area unicorn software company as a middle manager leading an inside sales team in Austin, Texas. And I was making good money in that role, and it was very rewarding in some ways. And I had a fantastic team, many of which I'm still in touch with today. It was a hot company and product. The compensation was good. So you might be asking, why would you leave an opportunity like that to go and work for a startup company? And part of it was I was trying to transition back into a closer role from being in a management role. I wanted to get back into doing enterprise sales because the enterprise sellers that I'd networked with up to that point were making crazy commission checks and huge W-2s. And I also realized that if you want to be considered for a VP of sales opportunity at some point, you've got to have a number of years of closing enterprise deals under your belt if you want to lead an enterprise sales team. So for me, I started looking for other opportunities. It was July, and I was actually out in Austin at City Park, if you know, you know, riding my mountain bike. And while I was on the trail, I ran into this guy who was also out there riding his bike, and we started talking. And he asked me what I did for a living, and I said I do tech sales and tech sales leadership. And he said, interesting, I just launched a startup. We just raised money, and we're looking for our first enterprise sales hire. And I was intrigued. It sounded like an interesting product. It was a very technical product. And up to that point, I had sold in the MarTech and e-commerce category. I had not had a lot of exposure to selling to developers, DevOps, and the CTO office. And so I was intrigued. I had heard good things and figured it would be a great move for my career. So we exchanged information, and that following week, we agreed to meet up in downtown Austin for a cup of coffee. He was going to bring his co-founder. That way we could all meet and greet and learn more about the opportunity and just discuss everything in greater detail. So we met up in downtown, had some coffee, talked about the role at hand, how much money they'd raised, what the product did and what it solved for, who they were serving, all those things. I found out in that process that the founders had already sold a company to a much bigger firm a few years before. So they were already exited founders who had some success. I'll get more into that a little bit later, but it was for me very encouraging to hear these guys. They were super technical. They had both been really early at a very well-known tech company that I'm not going to mention here on the air right now. But they had definitely the resume and the network to say these guys are the real deal. And so then they just basically asked me to write down a number on a napkin. Right there in the coffee shop, they said, what number would it take to get you on board with us? And I wrote down a crazy number. It was significantly more than I was making at the time because I thought, if I'm going to take the risk and the plunge here and go and work for a seed series startup, then I've got to make sure that I'm making enough to put plenty of money aside. That way I've got some cash flow and some runway in case things don't work out for me. So I wrote a number down. This number was probably like 40% higher than I was making at the time, something along those lines. Long story short, they didn't honor that specific number, but they countered and came pretty close to that number. And a few days later, I was signing the paperwork. There was a huge equity package as part of this role, which is pretty standard if you're joining as the first sales hire. You better be getting some equity, and you better also understand what that equity actually means. And that's something I've learned in the years since this experience. At the time, I don't think I fully understood what their cap table was or what that equity was actually worth. But on paper, it looked like a huge number, and I was very happy with the base salary and the commission structure that they'd put together. Keep in mind, these guys were both technical founders. They both had a background in building DevOps tools, databases, and platforms in the cloud computing space. They weren't sales guys. And in the big scheme of things, they really weren't business guys. Even though they'd sold a company before and had some good understandings of business, they didn't really know how to go to market. They had a few customers already, but they were pretty new to the direct selling motion. All the customers they had up to that point were either from networking or from their own Rolodex, people they'd reached out to from their own Rolodex and sold to. So that's what I was going into. Little did I know at the time how early things really were. So a couple weeks later, I started the job. And let me try to walk you through the first couple days. And this was years ago now, so remember my memory's a little foggy of how things really were, but I'll tell you some of the highlights. Some of the things I really remember was first just walking in. They were leasing space in a shopping center in West Austin. And so I walk in the first day and everyone's just sort of standing around. I was employee number 7 in the company, so there really wasn't a huge crowd of people. It was just a handful of people sitting in an office in a shopping center. Most of the hires at that point were engineers. And so there was a group of guys hacking away on the computer. And a few days before I started, they had actually hired a head of demand gen, which turned out to be a really good thing for me because she and I worked really closely together to not only generate leads, but to also follow up on those leads and make sure that we had pipeline building. And she was a real expert. She had done this many times before and had a lot of experience running campaigns with a shoestring budget. And she was really great to work with. So I walk in, I think the first thing we worked on in day one was they asked what CRM system they should set up. They didn't have a CRM system. They were managing their customer relationship on some database that they had built, and they realized that it was time to start investing in sales tools. So we spent that first week setting up HubSpot and loading it up with data. Within my first day or two on the job, I started going through the founders' contact lists in their phones and on their emails, looking for people in their Rolodex that we could reach out to and use their name to get a sales conversation going. And that campaign actually proved to be pretty successful. And that works for a while in a really early stage company. But typically by the time that a company's raised its Series A or beyond, you're past the point of being able to sell to the founders' network. But I'm really glad we ran that play. I basically emailed a bunch of people, and I think I put the founders' names in the subject line and said, hey, so-and-so asked me to reach out. I just got hired, and we're looking for opportunities to partner with great companies to implement our technology. Can we show it to you? It wasn't the most well-written email campaign, but it was pretty personal in the sense that these were direct connections of the founders. Then I remember also the investors in the company allowing me to do something similar to their network, probably not quite as extensively. I don't think I was given access to any of the VC's emails, but many of them made intros and offered to make intros to other companies in their portfolio. And that proved to be a really successful strategy. So that was really the first week, was like getting HubSpot set up, getting it loaded up with contacts, and then going through the Rolodex of the founders, and in some cases, the VCs, the investors in the company, opening up their Rolodexes or their portfolio to allow me to go and reach out to other CTOs that might be interested in our products. And so I just started getting the machine running. We did at around that time have, I think, an inbound lead come in, and it was for another technology company that was local in Austin. And what was great about that is it gave us a chance to go out and get on site with the company and spend some time with their engineers, which in a startup is pretty cool because they know you're an early startup. They were a growth startup. They were further along than us. It was kind of fun to do almost a hackathon day where we had all the engineers together in one room and they could see the value in the software we were building, and they were getting some insights into how this could help their company. So much of the job was trying to manage operations, doing actual outbound, and then strategy stuff, because there were so many conversations where we'd sit around with the founders and we'd try to figure out how to position something. I remember specifically staying really late one day in the office until after dark because we were going through how much we should charge for our services. We were there in the moment trying to build out our first big proposal, and the founders were there trying to figure out how much we should charge, what our unit rates should be. This was my first role where we were selling a usage-based product, so we were trying to figure out what the usage rates should be and what we should set as the minimum usage for our customers. And, those are the kind of things that it's hard to put a price on that in your career. I look back and say, wow, that was pretty cool that I got to sit and brainstorm with the founders of this company on how much we should charge for our products and how we should build proposals. I remember putting together the first order forms and the first master service agreements and doing all of those different activities. And again, being in person was pretty cool because we just would sit and brainstorm throughout the day on how we could get things better, how we could improve our messaging, where we could find more leads, and how we could keep moving deals along. And again, these guys were not salespeople. Neither of them had a sales background or a business development background. They were both engineers, very focused on building a great product. One of the founders was a little more of a visionary founder and had a lot more business acumen. He had done some other small businesses in his past, but was mainly a database engineer who was passionate about his vision. And so he helped me sell a lot in those early days. In fact, as the founding account executive hire, I didn't have an SDR. I didn't have a sales engineer. The founder was my sales engineer, and he would join me on the calls and pitch the technical aspects of the product. This was a very technical product, the likes of which I didn't fully understand until I had already come into the business. And so I spent a lot of time during those first few months learning terminology about cloud computing products and data streaming and some other things, and really trying to catch up on industry knowledge that I didn't already have, because we would get on these calls and these founders would start throwing out these acronyms that I'd never heard before, or they'd start talking about terminology specific to Amazon Web Services or AWS, and I was not in that loop, and I had to go and close that gap pretty quickly in order to be credible with our customers. Working with the team was a lot of fun. It can be a bit challenging if you're coming into a very tech-centered product as the only seller, because I was working with mostly engineers on the team, and a lot of engineers have a different perspective on how things should get done. And frankly, in that business, a lot of them poked fun at my, sales personality and the cheesiness of it all. And so sometimes that could be a little bit hard and lonely. Luckily, they had given me my own office, mostly because they didn't want to hear me making cold calls. And so I worked somewhat isolated some days, but the collaboration was really fun when we did have team building activities. Pretty much every day, those guys ordered pizza, and almost every day they drank, which was something I didn't expect coming into an early startup, but ended up being one of the reasons that I started to get disillusioned with the opportunity. Was some days it felt like the founders didn't want to work as hard as I was working, which led to some resentment and some animosity that in hindsight, I think I would have just had a conversation with them about and said, hey, you're putting a lot of pressure on my shoulders, and I'm not a founder in the company. You guys have to care about selling this more than I do. I'm passionate about this. I want this to be successful, but this has to go both ways, and I can't fall on the sword for your company. Where this really came to a head was they asked me to start delivering our sales results in the monthly board meetings, and this was super stressful for me. I had not had any experience working with a board of directors before this. I had, of course, a lot of experience presenting. I had done a lot of internal management and such at the larger companies I'd worked for, and I'm generally pretty good at presenting slide decks and results. But this was new to me, and working with venture capitalists can be very stressful. These are people who have put, in some cases, their own money into the business. This company had raised money from a really well-known venture firm in Austin, but they had also raised money from friends and family who were small business owners or private investors. And a lot of times those folks would show up for the board meeting, and they would get pretty angry at our results because in their minds, this should just fly off the shelves. And that's a pretty typical thing when you're in an early stage startup. Founders sometimes believe that everyone in the world should want it. And that was definitely the case. The founders really underestimated how much work goes into closing an enterprise deal. By the way, I wasn't up presenting poor results. In fact, we had a number of deals get done. In one case, we closed a $200,000 annual deal with a large technology company. We also closed multiple deals with different media companies, and we had some really great conversations with teams. And overall, we were having a lot of success. However, The founders had promised some pretty big revenue targets to the investors, and that's where the big challenge was for me, was standing up and feeling like I had to be accountable to these numbers, to this board of directors, even though I wasn't a founder in the company and I wasn't even a sales leader. I was just the first account executive hire. I didn't have a VP title or a head of sales title, and that was really frustrating and started to wear on me after a few months. The cold hard truth about working in a startup that was as early on as this one was, is it is really not that glamorous. So much of the job is just grinding the phone, sending tons of emails out, using LinkedIn, tapping the founders and investors' networks to try to find any opportunity you could. The sales cycles were really tough because you don't have a brand behind you. Anytime we got traction with a deal, we'd realize that we had to write up a custom order form or a custom service agreement, and we didn't have a lot of operating process. There wasn't a precedent for so many things, so it made every single deal feel like a fight to get across the line. So if you're someone who's thinking about getting into an early stage startup, just know that you will be wearing so many different hats. You've got to be an operator, you've got to be a marketer, you've got to be a closer, you've got to be an SDR, you've got to be a strategist, and really you've got to be a founder-minded person yourself. So many of the conversations, so many of the problems and challenges we encountered required a 30,000-foot view of how to solve it. And you also have to think ahead about whether what you're working on will actually scale for the company. After several months, the stress really started to wear on me. And the founders went through a period where they got somewhat disengaged and almost checked out. And I found out that they were leaving midday to go home, or sometimes they were going around the corner to the local pub and having drinks. And here I was making 80 to 100 phone calls a day, sending a bunch of emails, trying to get deals closed, putting together paperwork for clients. We also had a Slack channel that was meant for lead generation, so engineers could come into the Slack channel and get help with their challenges. And then I would recommend a product or service and ask for a call to discuss it in more detail. Here I was doing all these revenue generating activities only to find out that the founders were 2 or 3 drinks deep at the local pub. So you can more or less guess how the story ends. Although this is not something that I would recommend most people do, I got so burnt out that one day I actually walked off the job. It's the only time I've ever done this. It's the first and last time that I'll ever do it because I ended up being unemployed for quite a while after that. I should have lined up another opportunity, but I was so tired and so burnt out from the experience that I just had to get out of there for my own mental health. And so one day I came in, let the founders know that it wasn't right for me anymore and that I was moving on, and I left. That was it. About a year and a half later, they ended up fire selling the company to a much larger cloud computing firm. The deal got done behind closed doors. There wasn't a lot of press around the deal. I really don't know what the specifics were for that acquisition, so I'm not really sure how much money I left on the table by walking away. Either way, it was an amazing experience, and I certainly don't regret it at all because a lot of the things that I talk about on the show came from lessons and learnings that I developed while working in this environment. And what I think is spending even a year at a startup that's that early equates to probably 5 years of business experience. I learned a ton about what happens behind closed doors, how scaling and growth works. I also picked up a lot of technical knowledge because these founders actually demanded that I learn Python as part of my role. Even though they knew I wasn't a coder, they wanted me to have some product expertise and some technical expertise. So during that time, they were teaching me Python. We were spending a few minutes every day building applications and practicing writing on the command line, which was pretty cool and something that I think was a really great opportunity for me in the long run. So that's the story. That's the story of how I joined a seed series venture-backed company in Austin, Texas as the founding account executive. And this, by the way, was the first time I did that. I did it again later, and that's another story for another day. But I wanted to give you some insights into what it's like being that early in a company, all the different hats you wear, all the different challenges and obstacles that you're going to overcome, all of the different personalities that you're going to be working with. Founders can be amazing visionaries and leaders, but they can also be really challenging to work with, and they can really push you to your limits. Now, the best founders know this, and they do it in a way that's sustainable, but if you're working for founders that don't get this, it can be a serious challenge. So that's it. That's the episode and the story behind how I joined as the founding account executive at a seed series startup. I hope you enjoyed listening to the story. Reach out if you are considering working for a startup or you're being recruited by someone to go join as the founding account executive or founding SDR. Let me know. I want to help you evaluate that opportunity, assess what risks might be around the corner, and decide whether it's the right move for you for your career. There's a link in the show notes to schedule a 15-minute introductory conversation around my coaching. In my coaching, we can look at the opportunity. I can help you assess what the financial picture looks like for a startup. And again, generally help guide you towards what the best move might be for your career and whether you're someone who can handle the risk of going into an early stage startup. Thanks for listening, and until next time.